Hello and welcome to today's video. I apologize in advance, my throat's a bit weird and stuff. I have injured my gum, which is causing me a lot of pain, and the way I'm talking might sound a bit weird, I don't know. But anyway, moving on to more exciting news. Okay, so today's video I'm going to be talking to you about Scotland and the Scottish culture and history a bit, and just general Scottish stuff. There isn't really an overriding theme. I just wrote down a bunch of random stuff about Scotland that, well, not stuff, more talking points. So let's get into it. Okay, so the first one is the language, which is very interesting for me because online I have often been asked if I was American. There was actually an interview last year I had when I was talking about having an American friend on the internet, and I was asked, "Oh, are you American too?" And I was like, "No." Because I've spent so much time on the internet talking to people, I've sort of adopted a more Americanized way of talking, I guess. But on top of that, when I was a kid, I had a really bad speech impediment, which meant that I did a ton of speech therapy, which I believe sort of led to me having a more toned down accent than most people, which is really funny because I remember when I was in college, there was this girl from a certain part of Fife that I now live in, funnily enough. And yeah, she had this sort of accent combined with just the insane speed at which she would talk that, like, the college lecturers sometimes literally couldn't understand what she was saying, and I was like, oh yeah, she just said, insert thing, and I understood her perfectly because I'd sort of grown up around people with quite varied Scottish accents and stuff, and also people who were from the sort of rougher areas who had, the more, how do you put this politely? They didn't have a very polished, accent or whatever, which I always find really funny because I grew up in a really rough area too and stuff, but I ended up with more of a, I don't want to say normal accent, but definitely more of a, not as distinguishable. I don't know how to word it, but you probably understand what I'm talking about. The next thing I wanted to talk about was the Scottish flag, which most people will instantly recognize from Braveheart is the white cross through the blue background. Now, according to what I know, it's one of the oldest recognized flags in the world, which may or may not be true. I don't know. I've seen it said a bunch of times, so it must be true if it's on the internet. Okay, so whether or not it's just myth or not, back in, God, this was like ancient times or something, I believe they were fighting the English, but I can't remember for the life of me who it was they were fighting. The guy who was leading the Scottish army in the defence of Scotland was putting, everything into this one big battle, and he basically said to, I believe, God or something, hey, if you give me a sign, I will take that and we will use that for the rest of time and such for our country. And I don't remember the full story now. I wish I'd googled it before coming on here. But essentially, before the battle happened, up in the sky there was a big X that was white out of clouds, which does actually happen naturally from time to time. And he won the battle, and hence our flag is literally that symbol. It is an X and representing the clouds and a blue background. Again, whether or not that's totally true or not, may be debatable, but yeah. Oh, another cool thing. The Wicker Man films, the one with Nicolas Cage and the older one, I believe from what my last girlfriend told me about them, were based on the thought process a lot of people had about the Scottish Islands, especially the older one that didn't have Nicolas Cage in it. And essentially the fact that the Scottish Highlanders hadn't really given up on paganism as much as most of Scotland had. And, there was that whole belief system of, oh god, you must be doing all sorts of satanic rituals and shit up there, which, of course, to everyone's knowledge, they weren't really doing, but people genuinely sort of believed that because, Christianity and stuff. But, yeah, it's quite an interesting fact. Okay, for those of you who do not know, haggis is Scotland's national dish, as in food, and it is essentially... How can I forget what haggis is made of? Imagine all of the horrible things that normally when your butcher is butchering an animal, like the heart, the lungs, and such, that, he throws it out. Back in the day, Scottish peasants couldn't afford to throw it. Why are you wasting a good portion of the animal? You're crazy. So they would gather them all up. They would cut them down and mix it up with nowadays we would use herbs and stuff, but I don't know how realistic that would have been for actual Scottish peasants back in the day. Oh yeah, I'm just gonna pop to the shop and get some herbs. I don't know. I imagine they would have had some that they could grow themselves, so, but definitely not the modern stuff that we have. And they mix this all up with, I don't know if they use oats in haggis or not, but basically just a whole bunch of stuff, and onion and essentially whatever. And the most important thing about it is that it is cooked inside a sheep's stomach lining that has been washed, obviously, which is, funnily enough, why it is banned and illegal in the US, because America will not allow foodstuff that has been cooked inside of an animal's stomach because of hygiene reasons, even though it's completely hygienic if you just wash the thing. But yeah, I don't know if that's still the case or not, but I remember years back there was a big push in Scotland to try and get America to open up to buying haggis, and I don't know if it's true again, but I remember when I was watching Mythbusters years ago, they were talking about how the Canadians were actually smuggling haggis over the border sometimes from Canada to America, but I don't know there would be such a high demand for illegal haggis. The other nasty thing that we use to scare foreigners away food-wise is black pudding, which is commonly referred to as blood pudding, and a lot of other countries have these, but to us it's black pudding. It is essentially blood. It can be pig's blood or sheep's blood or just whatever blood you happen to have on hand, and you will mix it up with oats and herbs, and that's about it. Really satisfying meal, but again, this isn't stuff that was ever intended to be super high class and stuff. This was hey, we have nothing to eat, but there's a big pile of blood over there. Why don't we mix that with some oats and cook it? You can actually buy haggis and black pudding in a breakfast pack from like almost any corner store in Scotland, and you would generally eat it for breakfast if you wanted to. I do sometimes. There are no natural predators technically left in Scotland, in the sense that wolves are extinct, um, bears are extinct. I don't know if we ever had bears to begin with, but if we did, they dead. Basically anything like that, it's dead. There are some like birds of prey and stuff, I believe, still, but I think we killed a bunch of them too. And by we, I mostly mean, I don't want to say it was all the English's fault, but essentially we hunted everything on the island to extinction as far as like wolves and such go. Technically, there are wolves in reservation type places and stuff, but they're probably never actually going to return to the wild here just because the potential for messing up the ecosystem even further by reintroducing something that has been extinct for like over 1,000 years, you know. Oh boy, you can cause a lot of problems doing that. Another thing Scotland is famous for is a kilt, which a lot of people tend to assume is modern, like, common dress for Scottish people. It's really not, with rare exception to some people who will wear it just randomly. They are mostly reserved for, like, weddings or funerals or special occasions. People tend to just rent them rather than own them. But the modern versions aren't necessarily the true version of a kilt, because back in the day what would happen would be the Highlanders who were out for days at a time, you know, in the middle of nowhere in the Highlands where it was just completely desolate, would essentially use it as a tent. It was like a sleeping bag, it was their kitchen, you know, it was protection against the weather. It was insanely versatile to the point that it was noted all around the world in certain various histories that when they had Scottish mercenaries in really cold climates, even though they were essentially wearing a kilt that, you know, commonly mistaken for a skirt, they were generally quite comfortable compared to a lot of other people in pretty much any climate that they were in. And another interesting fact about them was that they were designed in such a way that when you were charging into battle, you could easily take the top half off and become, like, you know, half naked. And then also the lower half was also very easy to remove while you were running at someone. And there have been accounts historically of people literally charging at you with a giant sword who just suddenly start taking all their clothes off for some reason. I can only imagine they got really hot, but I don't know. There is definitely a psychological aspect to having someone charge at you like that with no armor on, who's just suddenly like naked and, you know. The next thing is Robert Burns, or as many people in Scotland call him, Rabbie Burns. Robert Burns was a famous poet who wrote a whole ton of poetry. What a lot of people probably don't know about him, and I haven't really fact checked this much, but he used to write under pseudonyms and such to protect himself, anti-English government propaganda poems and stuff, which arguably makes him even killer. In a time when, you know, you could literally be hung and killed by law for doing such. And yeah, he was a really famous poet, and we have a national day dedicated to him every year where we, not everyone will, but a lot of people will go out to events or whatever for what's called a Burns night, or a Burns supper more specifically, where they will recite poems that he wrote and such. They will drink whiskey, and most specifically, they will eat haggis. the reason the haggis is because he once wrote I guess you could call it a love poem for haggis called An Ode to a Haggis, which essentially talks about all of, the great qualities of a haggis and how it's just so much better than anything else. And yeah, it's a really kind of interesting thing about our culture that we enshrined this man in such glory because why not? Going further back into Scotland's history, some people might know about the Hadrian's Wall, which essentially, when the Roman Empire was conquering the rest of the world, they got to England and essentially conquered England to an extent, or completely. And then they got to Scotland and they were like, oh no. And eventually they built a giant wall stretching from the border of England on the East Sea to the west of the sea, which literally covered the entire land border of Scotland and England, and that was called Hadrian's Wall, which there's a lot of debate about it historically and stuff as to what it was actually used for, whether or not it was used more as like a sort of official marking point of borders and reasons for taxes and such. There definitely is evidence that the Scottish and the Romans were trading with each other to some extent, and it was less hostile, but ultimately it was sort of an end point to the Roman Empire, where beyond that wall, literally, the Roman Empire sort of ceased to exist. Which a lot of people argue, I would say very rightly, is because they couldn't conquer Scotland, but there are also a lot of counter arguments to that, which gets really long and quite awkward sometimes, but essentially it's the whole point that the Roman Empire started to sort of fall apart back home, and he didn't have the time and resources to really deal with Scotland that much, but yeah. But the one I wanted to talk about was actually called the Antonine Wall. Now, this Roman emperor guy looked at Hadrian's Wall and he said, no, that's not acceptable. We need to, we need to take this island. Like, why shouldn't we? There's a whole ton of resources in Scotland that we need, like their sheep or whatever. And so they essentially moved way further up to, I believe, the border with the Highlands. I know they went past Fife. I'm not sure, but they took over half the country, roughly, give or take. I'm not sure. I can't remember exactly where it was, but they definitely took like something like 3/4 of the country by that point. And then they built a second wall. Now this one, the previous one, Hadrian's Wall, it was like, oh, this is more just like a political border and such, even though it did have guard towers and everything. The Antonine Wall had like meters deep ditches that were meters wide, filled with like spears and stuff, and then there was like meters high sloped walls, and this crossed from one side of a country to the other side of a country with vast trenches and stuff to keep people from the other side out. It was a very, very militarized thing. There's no debate or mistaking what its intention was. And essentially that, to a lot of people, sums up where the Romans kind of gave up. And eventually they just completely abandoned that whole thing and then went back to Hadrian's Wall. But that, I believe, was around the time of the Roman Empire collapsing, but I'm not too totally sure on all of that. So going forward from there, historically speaking, so how did Scotland become Scotland? There was a bunch of for a really long time in Scottish history, it was sort of always divided between like a bunch of different, warring tribes that were essentially in a constant state of war almost, when they weren't fighting off foreigners like the Romans, the English, half of known Europe, and God knows who else made the mistake of coming to our island. Well, our part of the island anyway, especially the French. But yeah, there was one in particular tribe called the Scots tribe, and you guessed it, they ultimately became the one that conquered and or threw out all of the rivals. One of the most disturbing things I heard in a documentary once was that in order to ensure there was no competing bloodlines, the last act that the King of Scots took, the first true King of Scots, was to have a baby's head smashed open in a public square because that baby was the last in line to the throne that could possibly have opposed him. So if he didn't kill that child in, 20 or 15 or whatever years, that child may rise up and overthrow him or whatever. Or just in general, it might be disputed that, hey, you can't rule here because this child is, complicated stuff. But yeah, thank God we have democracy now, right? Where am I? Oh yeah, this one isn't super important to Scottish history or whatever. I just find it kind of funny. My curriculum head, when I was on a catering course, he was full of fun and random facts like this. Apparently, the people of Fife often refer to what normal people call a loaf of bread as a half loaf of bread, which can confuse a lot of people because it's like, well, you bought the whole loaf, why would you call it a half loaf? And apparently this comes from the fact that back in the old days, I have no idea how far back we're talking, the standard loaf tin size used to be like double the size, and then at one point you just cut it in half for some reason, and the people of Fife have been begrudging it ever since, apparently. Okay, 2 more things to go. So there is Scotch, which is Scotch whiskey specifically, which is a copyrighted and internationally recognized term, which essentially means Scotch is whiskey that's specifically made in Scotland. Now, this is interesting to me in particular because China, who are, I don't want to get too political here, but China very famously do not care about copyright laws at all. But to my understanding, the quality of Scotch had gotten so bad in China because of all of the, knockoffs and stuff, that even they had gotten sick of it, and they apparently really liked Scotch, which a lot of people do. It's one of our biggest exports, which is actually quite funny. We make something, I think it makes up something like 30%, don't quote me on that at all, because I'd have to Google it again, but it's like 30% of, I don't know if it's the UK's food and drink exports, or if it's just Scotland's food and drink exports, but yeah, Scotch whiskey makes up like a huge part of our economy and stuff. And it's, just generally internationally recognized that we make some pretty good whiskey. There is another interesting thing about that, where when we did that big trade deal thing with China, where they were willing to internationally recognize it as being its own thing, which kind of unique for China not to screw you over on that, they gave us 2 pandas for the Edinburgh Zoo, and we were trying to breed them, and they were on loan, but I don't think we ever managed to get them to breed. But yeah, my Malaysian friend put is essentially a bunch of Scottish people turned up with whiskey, and the Chinese didn't know what we wanted, so they just gave us pandas. Another interesting thing about whiskey is that if you put an E before the Y, apparently it's Irish whiskey specifically, whereas the Scottish spelling is more like just whiskey but without the E. I don't know why, but random information. And that's all I really have for today. But yeah, I hope you like this, and if you want to see more of it, let me know. I could probably go on for more and more hours with just random stuff off the top of my head, but I'm gonna stop there because this video is already getting a bit long. But thank you for watching, and if you made it this far, I hope you have a good day.